All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 15th, 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman of the Union Army left the city of Atlanta and embarked on what would come to be known as Sherman's March to the Sea, a 2-month trek east to the city of Savannah during which troops would destroy infrastructure, transportation, supply lines, an attempt to, quote, break the back of the Confederacy. Sherman's March would also become one of the most enduring stories told about the Civil War, and one that is no surprise full of a mix of fact and myth and agenda. And I think that's kind of the most interesting part of this story, which we will get into. But I first want to just read a little bit from Sherman's journals on this day, just as he's embarking on this journey. He writes, quote, "We rode out of Atlanta by the Decatur Road filled by the marching troops and wagons of the 14th Corps, and reaching the hill just outside the old rebel works, we naturally paused to look back upon the scenes of our past battles. Behind us lay Atlanta, smoldering and in ruins, the black smoke rising high in air and hanging like a pall over the ruined city." And then he goes on to talk about how a band starts playing John Brown's Body and so forth and so forth. But you have to wonder, how could a scene like that possibly lead to myth and misinterpretation? It's so locked in it. But here to discuss that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our guest for this episode is Sara Rubin, professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the author of, listen to this title, folks, Through the Heart of Dixie, Sherman's March and American Memory. And we love it when we have a guest for a topic who wrote exactly the book and exactly the angle that we want to discuss. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to get into, as I said, the sort of myth and the memory around this. I was wondering if actually you would indulge Kellie and Niki and I really quickly, and if we could just lay out in our minds what our one-sentence version of Sherman's March is, and then you can tell us why that is so off.
Okay.
So, Kellie, you want to start?
My one sentence is actually maybe not a sentence, but a song. And that's John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Like that song is like an anthem, a soundtrack, if you will, to the entire Civil War. But definitely this moment, for me, it rings pretty loud and clear.
All right. Niki?
Yeah, I would say mine is also not a sentence. I think we all flunked this assignment, but just like brutal and necessary. Like it was both really brutal and it was both really necessary to end this war that had been going on for 4 years.
And I will say, when I think of Sherman's March, I lived in Savannah for a while, and I felt like one of the stories that people in Savannah tell themselves is that Sherman burned down the entire South and then got to Savannah and said, oh my gosh, this place is so beautiful. What a charming city. I'm not going to burn it down. And Savannahans seem to love to tell themselves that story. And I confess that I kind of bought into that too. Very charmed by Savannah, Georgia. So, Dr. Rubin.
I don't even know which myth to bust first.
Okay.
Oh, no.
No, these are great. So I'm fascinated that Kellie said John Brown's Body, because, of course, the song that's most associated with Sherman's March is Marching Through Georgia. Mm-hmm. But, of course, that song isn't written until the march is over or partially over. It's written, I think, partially through. But that's the song that then becomes the cultural icon. And, President Jimmy Carter, when he was at the Naval Academy as a plebe, the way they would haze him was by forcing him to sing Marching Through Georgia. So
fascinating.
That's one piece where it endures. In terms of Savannah being so beautiful that it was saved, of course, the real story is that Savannahans surrendered to Sherman rather than have the city be bombarded.
Shocker they don't tell themselves that story.
I think they probably keep that one on the down low a little bit. It's not as heroic, I guess. Although this idea that Sherman spared certain places is a really prevalent myth, whether it's that he spared Savannah because it was beautiful, or he spared a given house because when he had been a young officer, he had been in love with a girl who lived there. There's all kinds of stories like that. So again, that sort of ties into it. And then for where Niki's coming from, this notion that it was brutal and necessary, that I think is actually pretty close.
Yes.
Not a competition.
certainly that it hastens the end of the war, and that it's brutal, although I don't think it's always brutal in the way that we think it was brutal. So I think one of the misconceptions that people have, because people say, oh, Sherman's March, birth of total war, is that it resulted in a lot of civilian deaths, because that's what total war looked like in the 20th century. It didn't result in civilian deaths, not directly. It's not as though they were rounding up civilians and killing them. It was a war against property. The indirect cause of that war against property, whether it's burning barns or gin houses, whether it's taking food, which I mean, mostly was taking food, or killing livestock, indirectly then that results probably in certainly civilian hardships. But it's not, you can't draw a straight line from Sherman to like the firebombing of Dresden or the atomic bombs, or famously, James Reston wrote a book called Sherman's March in Vietnam, where he tries to draw a link between Sherman's March and like the My Lai massacre. So I think that connection is a little tenuous.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that framing of total war, because when I was thinking about how we remember Sherman's March, it does seem like there is this destruction of all sorts of factories and railroads and cotton gins, and some homes are burned down. But it seemed like the idea of it being a total war was something that preceded Sherman's March, that he had to, that he felt he had to destroy those places because all of those places were involved in the war effort.
Exactly. And so that gets into a lot of the mythologizing about Sherman's March. Is it's not the first time that this is done in warfare. So they take, this idea where you have to destroy the civilian infrastructure because that civilian infrastructure is supporting the war effort is an old idea, of course. And it's not even new in the Civil War. It happens first in Mississippi with Grant and Sherman. And then right before Sherman's March, it happens in the Shenandoah Valley, where the Union destroys basically all of the food in the Shenandoah Valley. So he's not the first to do it. So one of the issues that I think about a lot and that I talked about in the book is, well, if he's not the first, then why is his this sort of dominant story? Why is this the one that everybody talks about? a part of it, I think, is there's just this kind of inherent drama in the idea of the march to the sea, right? It's got this destination. It's very fast. It's very easy to grasp. The other part, of course, of that is it completely ignores the second half of Sherman's campaign, where he goes up through South Carolina, the city of Columbia burns, and then up through North Carolina, and is in outside of Durham when the war comes to a close, and he accepts the surrender of Joe Johnston's army at the end of April 1865, after Lincoln actually has already been assassinated.
I think my question is, and you mentioned it earlier, and I thought it was really a good point, where you said this is not a total war, and that it's not the destruction of people, it's the destruction of property. But when you are enslaved, people are property. And so how did people make sense of Sherman's march, and how it liberated, all of the enslaved people who were in that area are basically following him on this march. And because, that's also their protection. The Emancipation Proclamation was like, if you can get to a Union line, you can get free, but you've got to get there. So it's like, I think about that duality of people and property on this march as well.
So I think the impact that Sherman's march has, and it's so complicated because, right, Sherman's army is an army of liberation. And there's no way to know how many people were freed by Sherman's march, but I basically did the simplest thing I could think of, which is I looked at all the counties Sherman's army marched through, and I looked at the 1860 census of how many people were enslaved in those counties, and that number was 400,000. But
400,000.
But of course, I mean, that's more people than his army had contact with, of course. But still, it's a huge number. But the problem also for enslaved people as Sherman's army is coming through is it's not a fixed Union line. It's a moving line, right? Yeah. So literally they're moving 10 miles a day. So if you want to join with Sherman's army, and thousands upon thousands of African Americans do, and they follow his army, then you run into the problem that Sherman himself, while not a supporter of slavery per se, is also very, very far from an abolitionist, does not want to have to deal with African American families. He's willing to take African American men who can be of service as a pioneer corps, as teamsters. He's willing to have them join his army, but he doesn't want to have women and children. He doesn't want them following. He doesn't want to have to feed them. And so he tries whenever possible to leave them behind. There's a really egregious incident that Sherman himself did not take part in, but one of his subordinate commanders, Jefferson C. Davis, there is a column is crossing through a swamp outside of Savannah an area called Ebenezer Creek. And there's Confederate cavalry behind them. And what happens is after the Union troops get through the swamp and across the swamp on pontoons, on portable bridges, Davis orders those bridges pulled up. And so all the African Americans who are following behind are then trapped between Wheeler's cavalry and this, I call it a swamp, but at that point it's really a river. And it was December, it was very cold. And so people plunge into the river, they drown, people are captured by Confederate cavalry. It actually causes a scandal because another officer, a junior officer, writes to his congressman. And so that actually then, this is a long story, but that actually then leads to the Secretary of War, Stanton, coming to Savannah, meeting with Sherman. Sherman and Stanton then have a meeting with about 15, I think, African-American ministers and leaders. They say, what do you want? The African-American ministers basically say, we want land. Sherman says, great. There's all this quote unquote abandoned land where white planters have fled. Let's distribute that to African-Americans. Let's give them each 40 acres in what comes to be known as the Sherman Reserve. And that, from Sherman's opinion, solves his problem because now all these African-Americans will stay and he can keep moving.
And some people think this is where the 40 acres comes from.
Right,
this moment
exactly.
of negotiation, yeah.
But you can tell Sherman has no commitment to it because a few months after the war ends, when goes away and the land is returned to whites, Sherman never says anything about it.
Yeah.
I feel like that story is so important, especially the one about the swamp, because when Sherman's march is told as a story of the army and its victims, the victims are always white Southerners and never Black enslaved people.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I think I am buying this argument that mostly Sherman is looking to the distinction between total war and hard war, and that most of Sherman's targets had some sort of tactical use. That said, there is language from Sherman like, we are not just fighting an army, we are fighting a people. We have to make old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of war. I quoted, the notion of breaking the back of the Confederacy. We have to make Georgia howl. What do we make of language like that? I mean, I read that and I'm like, there's a little bloodlust going on.
So Sherman for sure is a believer in hard war. And his argument was always, you make the war terrible so that people will stop fighting. And that for white Southerners, the way to end this treatment is to surrender. So he's very clear-eyed that he thinks this is the way to bring the war to a close, to make it so terrible that people can't endure it. But then he wants a kind of soft peace. So hard war, soft peace for Sherman. But you can't deny the things that he says, and he means them when he says them, for sure.
Well, and I wonder, to your point earlier about how it's just sort of interesting that it's Sherman's story that seems to have lingered around while others maybe have not. I mean, part of it might just be, he's a very colorful writer. And, I read that description of leaving Atlanta and language like this. I mean, often that's whose story ends up kind of being told.
His memoirs are great. They're terrific. Because he's such a good writer. He really makes it interesting, and he's a great. And as soon as you started reading that passage, I know that passage. I use that passage in my classes, and I talk about it. And he is a good writer.
Well, and I mean, I wonder, that passage, the thing he chooses to write on this day that we're marking here, from the moment he leaves Atlanta, and he writes about looking back upon behind us lay Atlanta, smoldering and in ruins, the black smoke rising high in the air. I mean, you can just see from that one phrase how this notion of total war, we're just going to leave everything burning and smoldering behind us, would evolve from that.
I also think it's interesting, too, because, early in the war, Lincoln is very much about bringing the South back into the Union, not, returning fugitive slaves, not trying to dismantle the institution of slavery. He's getting a lot of pushback from his generals and radical Republicans who are like, you are not doing enough. And matter of fact, you are undermining some of our agenda. And I wonder about Sherman's relationship with Lincoln as well, because this hard war or even total war, I think, goes against a lot of what Lincoln, at least initially, was trying to accomplish in bringing the Confederacy or the South back into the Union.
Yeah, I think that's a case where Lincoln is the one who evolves over the course of the war. And so that by 1864, especially this is the fall of 1864, has come to realize that this is what it's going to take, that there's no way to otherwise, I think, break the back of white Southerners was to make the war so terrible. And so that's why you can see he's skeptical initially of Sherman's plan, but he's willing to let him do it, in part because Grant also is a big supporter of Sherman.
When you read about kind of how history has the story of the march has shifted through history, one thing I've seen pop up a couple times is, everyone's idea of what Sherman did in Georgia is a little overinflated, but what they think he did in Georgia, he actually did in South Carolina. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, that's actually completely right. They are much harsher in South Carolina. And Sherman talks about, he has this great passage in his memoirs that is very disingenuous, because he says somehow the men got the idea that South Carolina was the cause of all their troubles. And he says basically that it's the men who want to take the gloves off in South Carolina, and that he doesn't want to have to restrain their fighting spirit. He doesn't want to sort of break their spirit. And so he lets them. So yes, it's much more vicious in South Carolina. It's much more, there's a kind of angrier, more personal edge in South Carolina.
And why is that?
Because South Carolina started the war.
Yeah.
By seceding first. Is the big reason for it.
There's the first shots at Fort Sumner.
Yeah.
And so that's why. And then when they get to North Carolina, which has more Unionists, let's say, than South Carolina, certainly, Sherman wants to pull his men back and have them be sort of, again, a little kinder to civilians, a little more judicious. But it's tricky. It's tricky to get the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that starts to get us to where the myth around the March to the Sea comes from. I mean, when does Sherman become this larger-than-life figure among white Southerners and this kind of the devil of the war to them?
That's a great question, because you think it would be immediately after the end of the war, and it's not. I think it comes later. So there's this period of time in the 1860s and 1870s where white Southerners are so busy, I think, resisting Reconstruction, that they haven't, the ideas about Sherman haven't fully gelled. And because Sherman is not a supporter of civil equality, he's not really engaged in those debates. Mm-hmm. He's general in chief of the army for the 1860s and 1870s. So he actually takes a big tour of the South. And now I can't quite remember the year. I want to say it's around 1878, where he goes back to Georgia and he goes to Atlanta and he's celebrated. They have a ball in his honor. And it's really interesting. And there's articles where people, they joke around like, oh, hide the matches, right? But it's sort of warm, right? It's a sort of warm reception for him.
Wow.
And then even in the 1880s, he's still, one of the turning points, I think, would be Jefferson Davis when he published his Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, which is 1881. And he really attacks Sherman for the march and for the cruelties of the march, is a piece of it. Even then, I still think into the 20th century, Sherman is not seen as this 100% villain. I ascribed a lot of cultural power to Gone with the Wind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think Gone with the Wind really changes public perceptions of Sherman and the march. First the novel and then the film. And of course, what I didn't realize until I started reading it, I had read Gone with the Wind as a child and had watched the movie as a kid. I'm always embarrassed to admit that we saw it in 8th grade history class.
Wow.
In New York.
Same.
Yeah. But in New York, they showed it to us.
Yeah.
I'm sort of aghast at that now. But Sherman, of course, is never on screen. He's always off screen. He's this sort of boogie monster. But I think that, and the burning of Tara actually is not Sherman's march. Tara's burned when they're outside of Atlanta. So before Sherman takes Atlanta. But it sort of blots everything out culturally.
It's so embedded in our historic mythology that it was actually kind of refreshing and surprising to see that in 2014, so on the 150th anniversary of, I think, of the march, they unveiled a new historical marker in Atlanta that talks about the popular myths of the war and tries to recontextualize the March to the Sea in more accurate historical terms.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm always leery of this idea of accurate versus myth.
Fair.
And so that was one of the things when I was working on my book, I really tried to push against, which was this notion that there's one true story of Sherman's March. And the way that I did my research and the way that I wrote about it and built a website about it is this notion that there's multiple stories.
Yeah.
And what was interesting to me was, what are the stories that are told and why is that the story that survived rather than was it really true or not?
That's good.
Aside from stories, are there any other sort of physical markers of the march? I mean, I've been to certain parts of Atlanta where people have said, well, this neighborhood was burned, by Sherman. And I've, as we now know, lived in Savannah where people said, well, Sherman spared this wonderful building right here. But, are there other parts along the march that are just like interesting spaces to look at, interesting sort of remnants, physical remnants?
So there are not as many physical remnants of the march as you maybe would want to see because it's been 150 years. Yeah. So one of the things I look at are in the book are travel accounts, and you have these people traveling through the South in like the 1930s, and they're like, "Oh, look at all these burned chimneys, remnants of Sherman." I'm like, are they?
Yeah, interesting.
Something burned in the interim. You can
that was a grease fire 5 years ago.
Right. So you can see the South Carolina State House has markers on 5 or 6 spots where the stone was chipped by shells, a bombardment of Sherman's march. But there's not that, and there's a few places that are still maybe, I think a couple of ruins maybe in Barnwell, South Carolina, but there's not as much. I think it was Franklin Graham, who was this great historian of Atlanta, who once said, Atlanta's destroyed more than Sherman ever did, right? Like, because you're constantly building and rebuilding.
Yeah.
And actually, you mentioned historical markers, and the historical markers that were put up in the 1950s, I thought they would be a lot more of like, they burned this house or such and such happened here. They're almost all just troop movements. They're really not that interesting. Yeah. So there's that.
Well, our podcast can count as one of the more interesting historical markers, I suppose.
Right.
But I think I've mentioned this before on the show, but I can't not say that one of my favorite films of all time by one of my favorite filmmakers of all time is called Sherman's March by the documentarian Ross McElway. It basically has nothing to do with the march. He sets out to recreate the march and ends up just making it about his failed love life. But it is one of my favorite documentaries, and probably didn't shape many people's version of the march, but certainly somewhere deep in my brain did.
It did actually, that movie, that movie when I was in graduate school, it did sort of get me thinking, wait, why Sherman's March? And so it is actually one of the reasons I started this project, was seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, a genuine genius in my mind, Ross McElway, one of my favorite films. So we'll put it on the syllabus. Okay. And Sara, Rubin, thank you so much for doing this. This was super.
This was my pleasure. Happy to do it.
And folks, if you want to read the book, which has lots more, it is called Through the Heart of Dixie, Sherman's March, An American Memory. All right, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kaula Nakua helps with transcripts. Julie Shapiro is executive producer for Radiotopia. Get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments or ideas for the show. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com, where you can also get our full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter, where we are posting stuff each and every day. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.